Hello everyone. Today we have a very special video for you, and I say we because this was organized together with Rainier from Rainier Books. And yeah, basically, if you have been following the channel, you know that Rainier and I made a few videos of in-depth conversation about The Great Offshore Grounds by Vanessa Veselka, and Rainier was able to organize an interview with Vanessa Veselka. Vanessa Veselka is an author based in Portland, and she's also an artist and a very politically aware and politically active person. She's also a union organizer and many other things. And it shows in this novel. And since we both liked this book so much, we were really, really excited to welcome Vanessa Veselka and ask her lots of questions. And this is the result. So I want to thank both Rainier and Vanessa for organizing and agreeing to this. Without further ado, here is the interview with Vanessa Veselka.
We never got out of phase one for real.
Mm.
And so it's not a huge difference, but it is a difference on the businesses because the outdoor, so in the there's really not been much indoor dining or anything at all, and people have been very leery about, but I think the difference is, going back a step, is it means that, it's November here, it's starting to be cold and rainy, and so the outdoor seating in restaurants was gonna get closed out anyway, which is sort of how everybody was handling it. So I think that's some of it's in advance of just everybody packing in, because it's bad. It's not bad. We've been very lucky, and we've been lucky because we acted early, and so we haven't had the same numbers that a lot of other places. But I am working right now as a union organizer, which is something I did for years ago, and came back and have been, sorry, I'm still sort of waking up. And so I work with nursing home workers and assisted living facilities. It's a death march. And so these are people who are paid basically minimum wage. They don't have health care. They don't have any of when the US sent down for us, this is insane to say to a European, but this additional 80 hours that they would allow people to take sick time if they didn't have it, so that it wouldn't spread. They denied it to healthcare workers because they decided they were too essential. They were afraid that if they called out, then, and so instead you have people making $15 an hour at the absolute poverty line with no health care and no ability to stay home, having to go into, nursing home facilities and others. And it's just a fucking mess. So, yeah. So I live deep in the world of the politics of nursing homes, lockdowns, governance,
Yeah, we haven't started talking about your amazing novel, The Great Offshore Grounds, but it feels like we all have already started talking about the novel because there's so many issues
yes.
that seem similar here. Paula, do you want to start with the first part?
I had the question about also about Corona, and how are you finding to promote your book in this time? Go to events and things.
It's hard. It's hard. I am. I've done a lot of Zoom events. I've done a lot of things that can be. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get out of the direct light in my eye. And everybody's been amazing and talented, and it still sucks. It still sucks.
Yeah.
It is for two reasons. One, everybody's in the same position, which means that, normally when you're promoting a book, your bigger writers are going to be in this, this level of the promotion stream, and your mid-list might be here, and your indie writers might be, and now we're all sharing the same narrow bandwidth, which is, what do you see on the front page of a bookstore or the front page of the New York Times, or, you know what I mean? We're all sharing that tiny spot. And And then at the same time, I mean, it sounds really basic to say, but it's hard to sell books when bookstores are closed.
Yeah.
Like for people like me, my friend Lydia, but like many of the writers that I'm sort of in a cluster with, you know, our work lived and died because indie booksellers hand sold it and talked about it and did shelf talkers and put it on tables and like created conversation around it. And that's not, I mean, you can't do that. There is none of that. So for bigger writers, you see these figures like, oh, you know, for bigger writers, it's kind of like, well, people are buying books and reading. It's like, yeah, but what are they reading? They're reading things they're familiar with. They're reading things that are the latest new thing. They're reading things that, you know, I mean, like there's a different, so it's been hard, you know, and I'm very grateful for, you know, I mean, bottom line in writing, you're grateful for anything you get, you know, in terms of any support. I mean, I always come from the baseline, like, there was never necessarily a world in which I got to make a physical book that I didn't pay for. You know what I mean? Like, so I try to come from that as a baseline, but yeah, I'd be lying saying it's hard. You know, I had a 30, you know, my entire time that I waited 2 years to be off to go do, I spent on Zoom in my living room, just like every other month before that. I live on Zoom. So, but hopefully I will get to be a human and see other humans again soon.
Yeah, and I mean the book is great, so hopefully it will get more people.
Well, I appreciate your kind thoughts. You're very generous with your time.
You have worked so many years on this book, 9 years, I believe. And what was the first thought of writing such an enormous book with so many angles, so many topics that we could talk? We could talk for hours, of course. But how did it start? What was the first idea?
The very first idea was really, well, what do I care about? What am I afraid to write? What do I think I write badly? And let's go there. And sort of, it was very instinctual, but it was also, you know, it is my nature to sort of think about, okay, what am I afraid to write about? What's scared? Because what I'm looking for is, of course, energy to a certain degree. Like, where is there conflict in me? Because if there's conflict in me, it ends up being in. And so I knew that I was afraid to write about, and it also started with this other element, which was, I feel like the American novel, and this is of course big generalities, but I feel like there was a point in the 1940s or 50s, and it definitely gets blown up through the MFA system a lot, where they say, okay, we're going to cut the great American novel, which comes from, you know, obviously English and other, you know, novel Spanish, but we're going to cut this thing in half, and we're going to say plot goes this way, and language freedom and character development goes that way, and you know, this is in America. Like, this did not happen in most of the rest of the world, but it happened through the MFA system in America. It happened through sort of like, this is where literary lives, this is where story lives, and that they were separated that way. And they were sort of became very, particularly in the literary side, very fetishized. There's always this discussion of like, is literary fiction a genre itself? You know, and I think there's a very good argument that the way that it's been looked at, taught, and built, you know, in the last 30 years, say yes, it's absolutely genre. There's no reason that every single syllabus in the country should basically have the same writers on it. You know, I mean, on one hand, yeah, you can say, okay, that's canonical. On the other hand, it's like, is it? You know what I mean? Like, or is it just the same syllabus from Iowa for the last 30 years? You know, like, you know, and so I think that one of the other things is I was like, I love these big plot-driven, somewhat, you know, sometimes sappy novels, you know, of the 19th century that are intense and adventurous and all of that in early 20s. But I also love modernism, high modernism. I also love, you know, the beats. I also love the ability to just be more, to break things at the line level and do what I want to do in subject matter and all of that kind of stuff. And so part of the experiment was, could I do both? And what does it mean? You know, can I try to do both? Do I have to give up one thing or another? And I found in the course of that, there were some things I couldn't do both with, which was a little frustrating and took me a while to accept, but there were other things I could. And so from the beginning was the idea that I was about to construct something that very likely would please no one. You know what I mean? That it wouldn't be as invulnerable and, incisive and this and sort of brusque and intense as my first novel which is, by the way, extremely political. And then at the other hand, it was like, and it's not going to satisfy the people who read for plot and this and that and want to know why there's ghosts of Walter Raleigh walking around. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to please. So it was a somewhat of a fail, doomed to fail kind of thing. But that's how the project started, was how do I write? How am I not afraid to write about love and death and those things? And how am I able to still be free and write the way I want to write? And then there's a bunch of nerdier technicalities that I came against. I'm inspired as much by authors as I am by everything, art of all kinds, and also just humans on the street corner. The big authors I thought about in this, of course, were a lot of the big 19th century, writers that I loved. And the reason I was thinking of them was not that I was mimicking them or putting them, although structurally there's a lot of mimicry, but more becoming accustomed to my own resistance to vulnerability or what might be perceived as sentimentality or all of these things, was to, like, wait a minute, I loved these books. I loved War and Peace, and people forget, like, what a great love story it is in so many ways. And actually there's a character in, there's all sorts of little things I put in for myself and my own entertainment in the novel. And there is a character from War and Peace that is in the Great Offshore Grounds in a way, which was Pierre Betzukov was the original model for Essex in some ways. And so I intentionally put him in the early scenes as somebody sort of too big and hulking and uncomfortable at a party saying the wrong things, which is very much like this. So I was very intentionally thinking of the salon scene in that around. So but those were my love letters back and forth to something. They were not important to other people in any way, but they were part of me coming to terms with not being afraid to write about certain aspects of emotion that are not, so there's this line of, like, you become so afraid, and I always tried to think I wasn't, but apparently I was, and I found that out in the writing. You become so nervous, I think for women in particular, about what might be perceived as sentimentality because it's perceived as feminizing, right? And the novel inherently has always been a female audience, like enormous, even from the 19th century. The people, like, buying novels were women, like, in a lot of ways. That a lot of the readership was female. And not all, but like a lot of it was. And so there's this anxiety about, and I've seen it in the book, like my first novel never got put, even though it was almost all female characters, never got put in a women's fiction. Never. I never did. It was like, I had just as many male readers. It was never classed in that. I never had any discussion about that. This one, you flip it over, you look at the libraries in the States, and it says it's women's divorce fiction. So,
Okay.
or domestic fiction. It gets classed as domestic fiction in most places. And so that gets under my skin a lot. And so again, there's a cost for opening up to some of those things. And I do see that, like, yep, the chances of a 25-year-old guy in a bookstore picking up my work is now very, very low compared to every other thing I've done. And that was the cost of not hiding from some of those things. And I have feelings about that.
Yeah, that's strange because at least for me, it had a lot of elements of Moby Dick, and I will never say that Moby Dick or any of these other epic adventures are domestic fiction.
Right. I mean, and yes, there are definitely elements of Moby Dick and also on the whale ship Essex, which was what
Yes.
Bill based Moby Dick on, the story of the Essex.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, nor because you make the assumption that simply because women are having experiences doesn't mean that they are not human experiences.
Yeah.
You know, I sound like a cranky old lady, but it pisses me off.
No, I can understand.
We had a little, Paula and I had a little discussion about, because we were talking about that there are so many social issues, and you have talked about working as a union organizer. And I just today I read your article in The Atlantic 9 years ago, where you talk about how you try to organize people you worked at Amazon and tried to organize people there. And there's so many social issues in the book. And I said, I think I misspoke a little bit. I said, this is a very political novel as well, which was probably not planned to be a political novel, but all the social issues, of course, get very political. And even when you see you have worked on this for so long, apparently Donald Trump was not president of the United States, but there's so many reasons that gave the United States Trump. And maybe you are also writing about all those reasons, and you started doing this before he became president.
Yeah, and I would say it is a political novel in certain ways, although that was another difficulty. I have to put it in the context of my first novel to some degree, which was a novel called Zazen. And Zazen was extremely political. It is it's a first person narrator who is deeply, deeply conflicted about politics on the left and also what she's seeing on the right. And, I've had people come up to me, mostly people of color, before and say like, I can't believe that you wrote this before Black Lives Matter, because this, I mean, it has the sort of what it looks like I'm writing about Black Lives Matter in a whole section of it. And I'm not, I mean, I am and I'm not, right? Like that was the day that they decided to name something on a Twitter thing is not when that problem started, right? Like it's, to me, those things were obvious. And over the years of that novel, which I wrote in 2011, I would frequently, every couple of years, people going like, I mean, it opens with somebody tracking immolations, self-immolations, and it came out in the Arab Spring. And it opens with tracking self-immolation. Like, so there was this constant, and people would say to me, and still say to me, how did you know it was going to be like that? Or how did you, it's like, it's all around, it's obvious. Like, it's obvious to me what's happening and where all these tensions are and how, like, it's affecting things. And so, every couple of years, they're like, this looks like, and even last year people, and in fact, it will come out again next year because they're reissuing it. And they're saying, like, it's just so timely. It's like, unfortunately, these things, iniquity, social injustice, racism, class, rich people taking away, everything they can and running off with the prize. Like, unfortunately, it's always timely, right? So that novel was very, very political in a very direct, character-driven way. And when I sat down to write this, that was another aspect of like, I don't think I write anything that's not political in some sense, because it's in my constant, every question I have is how, the question Lenin had, is like, what is to be done? You know what I mean? Like that is what drives everything I'm writing, whether that's inside a relationship or whether that's inside a society. And so when I was writing this novel, one of the things that was uncomfortable for me a little bit, again, with the sort of fears of sentimentality or the fears of being perceived as too feminized and that go with that. And to pair with that, when you are perceived as too feminized, that means that you lose like at least 50 points in your intellect, like in people's perception about what they're willing to give you as a creative person. Like, it means automatically everything you write is biography. Nothing is invented. You like, it is like you were a creature of intuition. You mean like your entire intellect as a female artist just doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't exist. So, in all of those moments of decision and protection at the line level that had to be broken through, was also this thing of like, I was nervous about the fact that it wasn't political in an overt way, even though it was clearly political in other ways. I was very like, it made writing harder and longer because, living in the last 8-9 years, myself very immersed in those things, it felt so indulgent to be writing a novel that wasn't overtly, well, I mean, not indulgent. I felt very weird about writing a novel that was so, my least overtly political novel in a time that was so, where a lot of the political conversations I'd been having for years was coming to the fore. But some of that was a need, again, to find a perspective to say something about how I see the nature of politics in many ways. So everything I write is political. I did not set out to write a political novel, but I was uncomfortable many times and stopped writing many times during the process, because I was like, why does it matter what I'm writing right now? Given all of these things, does it matter to be writing this, to spend time on this? And that was a question that came up over and over and over. So I should have warned you. I give long answers. You could just ask me 2 questions and I'll take them. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. I thought I had all my, let me knock this off. All these stupid little beeping things that come through if you aren't. Okay.
Yeah, but I think that actually it is a timely novel. You probably didn't intend it that way, but this novel focuses a lot on the healthcare system, and I think that's something that right now we need to talk a lot about. So in that sense, it was timely, I guess.
It's interesting. It went through a phase where this is a very American perspective, and I know, I mean, I lived in Europe for a period of time, and I know, you know, that people understand we don't have healthcare, but the degree to which it affects our lives is often not understood if you haven't had to live through it. And when I was writing this, there was a period of time where I had to change the storyline because the ACA gave healthcare to people for the first time in certain areas. And you know, there's still like subsidy, you know, all sorts of Medicaid functions and things like that. But, you know, that was an interesting moment because a lot of times people belittle that brought and how little it was at the same. You know what I mean? Like it was real enough that I got healthcare for the first time. And yet, you know, completely insufficient to the need of what's out there. The other thing is resources and resource extraction, and this idea of constantly chasing El Dorado and constantly chasing, you know, the whale into the, you know, you know, we live in a time of peak oil, and that the idea that the very last drop of whatever we can get out of the ground will be worth more than anything that came before it. And we have an incentivizing system that says that we're, you know what I mean? Like there's something broken in that system that's so deep, whether it's a sort of, mythical resource, you know, we'll find the perfect myth someday that allows us to always be right, and you know, the ultimate hero's journey myth, or we'll find just the right resource. Yeah,
that's also what I thought when I read about the great offshore grounds. I haven't heard the term before I read your book, and I thought, and then I looked it up. What is it? What are the great offshore grounds? And it seems like a new last frontier. That because what you said, you always have to find something new to discover, something new that makes you even richer and that satisfies your desires and your dreams, fulfills your dreams, but it never does in a way.
and puts off decisions, puts off the hard calls of what's worth something and what we have to trade for it. What do we have to give up for each other? You know, what individually do we have to give up to get through this together? And I think as long as you're moving into frontiers, you never have to face that question, really. And the Great Offshore Grounds was just an idea that like really captured me about it. I'd read a novel called, or not a novel, but I'd read a nonfiction book called In the Heart of the Sea, which they turned into an atrocious movie that should never be shown. I walked out on it. I loved the book. And it's all about the whale ship Essex, which is the story that Melville read. He met some of the people who had been on the Essex that like haunted him. And it's fascinating because his first Type E, which was his first novel, I think, you know, Melville had been shipwrecked in somewhere near Tahiti, I think, and had a grand old time, and Typee is like a sea adventure, it's got this, and then he goes away and then he has this whole other situation and meets the captain, one of the captains of the Essex, which, they end up all eating each other. And it's the world's worst sea story and they all deserve it. But, and then he goes back and he gets haunted and he writes Moby Dick, and the story of the Essex is really fascinating. And I think it's also fascinating because, Melville was even seeing at that point this, think about that last image, this image of like this ship going down, this eagle and this, Indian Native American, like, and the flag, and it's all going down, what I mean? Like, it's just incredible. And my understanding, I think, is that like basically the publisher was like, you got to put another ending on that. Like, you can't just leave it there. So there's a little bit of tinkering afterwards to try to, address the intensity of tone. But that's it's the human experience, but it is very much the American experience when you look at cities upon hills where nobody supposedly lived. And, that comes out of Augustine, that comes out of all of this, but definitely ends up in the middle of the ocean.
Your description of America is, of course, both the landscape and the sea surrounding the United States is a topic of the book. And I read this book by Tom Zollner. It's called The National Road, Dispatches from a Changing America. It was published in October. And it reminded me so much of your book, because Tom Zollner also has driven around America for decades. It seems he's always in a car and he always shows us different things. I read that you have Czech, part of your family is from Czechoslovakia, and you wrote that I think from your father's side, the people were oil trash, something like that, in Texas. They're working oil. And Tom Zollner writes an essay in his book about Czech immigrants to the United States, and Antonin Dvořák coming to Iowa and working as butchers, mostly with meat. So the whole country and the immigration to the country is also very present in that novel. And the whole country, how much have you traveled through the United States? I mean, this is amazing, all those road trips and sea trips your characters.
I traveled in a very particular kind of way, which was that I left home at 15 and I began hitchhike in circles around the country because I had nowhere to sleep. So I would sleep I would sleep in cars or while they were moving, or in trucks, long haul truckers. And so I ended up just being in constant movement through places and constantly having to like stay alive in very dangerous situations. And in that period of that first year, I hitchhiked about 16,000 miles around in circles, in trucks, up in all of these places. I've been in, I've driven through every state. But I think I've, have memorable experiences in most of them. And I think there's a different kind of traveling when you're a teenage girl and you have not a penny to your name and you have to stay alive, stay safe. But you also have to be charming. Somebody's going to feed you, right? Like, you've got to be able to navigate social tenor of very different people and know like how dangerous, how not. There's a grifting aspect to it. There's a survival aspect to it. To do that for a year solid. And then after that, it was kind of, I traveled less that way, that, I sort of, and I ended up in Europe by the time I was 18. And I had a one-way ticket, and I was playing, I'm a musician as well. And so I was playing guitar at that time, and I could busk a little bit or in Europe, but I basically couldn't afford Western Europe. It was just too expensive to be in. This is 1987, 88. And so I began to sort of slum through, again, all hitchhiking or, trains, getting on trains without tickets and talking my way out of it, which is how I went to Turkey in 88. Like, crazy stuff. But, spending a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia, and the people that throughout all of these travels that I was living with were poor people, undocumented, people working. They were, in Vienna, they would have been the Yugoslavian and Turkish workers. In Yugoslavia, they would have been Romanian, and like there's an underclass of national, and there was sort of a flow of how you get deported depending by where you stand in the monetary system. Like there's a whole flow about, because I was an American, even though I had no money, I had an American passport, people would assume I had money, so I could get into places. Spent time in Bulgaria, spent a lot of time in Turkey, but it was all very sketchy, and I was making my money hand to mouth by playing guitar in various places. And then I came back to the States. I moved 11 times before I was 9. So I was used to traveling. And then I had traveled as a hitchhiker. And then I began in the 90s I lived in Seattle. I was a musician, and I began to tour extensively. So I would do 45-day van tours, 4 or 5 of them, plus a bunch of long regional legs. I know this country really well in terms of travel and road. Like, I guess I'm trying to like say, it's like, I know it really well. And I know it from the angle of having no money and sleeping in your car, or having no car and sleeping in someone else's car. That is how I know this country. And it has given me, in some ways, a limited point of view, and in other ways, a very rare point of view. Because the way that they're the people who prey on people like that, the people who try to help people like that, the people who see themselves in people like that. It's a whole world that, like, it populates my work as well. And it's also true, one of the things I'm working on now is a novella and a collection about that time. It's fiction, but it brings in some of those elements about my experience in Europe in the late 80s, which was a very different Europe at that time, and different Eastern Europe, and as you guys all know.
Yeah.
Oh, the U.S. roads a lot.
I was just asking, did you also make trips to prepare for the novel specifically, or just you took the experience from the previous travels you had done?
There were a couple of trips I took in research with the novel, but they were more about learning than remembering, although one had a kind of crossover effect. I worked on a tall ship for a month, and it was the Brig Niagara, which is a 14 sheet square, not square rigger, brig. And I worked on the Niagara for a month, and where I really experienced, and learned the very basics of what it feels like to be and work on a ship like that, and sleep and live on a ship like that. And then I went back up. I have a long history with Alaska, Southeast Alaska, and the Tlingit people to some extent. I have a clan tie to the Tlingit. And I went up because I hadn't been there for some years. I happened to, but it's more like the places I go that sort of awaken an idea in me. It's usually not, I need this and I'm going to go do this. It's usually more symbiotic than that. I was up in Southeast Alaska to, honor somebody in a 40-day party, which is part of a sort of a set of rituals around the passing. They'll say, and it shows up in the novel, but the Tlingit will refer to somebody's death as, they walked into the forest. They'll say so-and-so walked into the forest on this day, So, and then there's a 40-day, and then there's something called the Kulich, and that's a year-long potlatch. I mean, there's a variety of stages you go through, and depending on where you have responsibilities to host or not host. And so I'd gone up for something like that, and it brought back a lot of memories from when I was younger about what I knew from that world in a limited way, but what I knew. And that definitely, so then it was a joy and a lovely thing to be able to put in aspects in the novel, and there are, again, in those areas, lots of very personal indulgences about reference to family or story. So.
Yeah, you can learn so much about the United States. I mean, I looked up some of the places you mentioned, especially those in Alaska, on YouTube, and saw videos about those places. And it's such great reading to read your book, and then to go to that place in a video and to say, now they're there. Livy is here now.
Oh.
So that's very interesting. And as well, I think maybe my last question about these two ladies, two girls, two young women, Livy and Cheyenne. They are 33 years old, and somehow it feels like a coming of age story as well. But they are 33 already, so maybe a little bit too old for coming of age, but they're still looking for a place in life, of course. But I think you did that on purpose to make them looking for a place where they are safe and secure and can live a decent life, probably.
There are two coming of ages, and there's the sort of classic first out of, your interaction with your family, your personal myth in the world, where you break into adulthood, your ideas about what you will be, and coming into that. And then I think that you're really running on your teenage concept of self for quite a while. What you find good, bad, worth, trade, experimentation, etc. And then I think you start to get in your late 20s and then moving into your 30s into another stage of that. And the stage that I'm interested in, and this is where I want to back up and say, well, what do we mean as coming of age, right? We talk about it in literary terms often as, emotional maturity, understanding of self, arc of growth. But in society, we mostly treat it as economics. What's your status? Are you beautiful enough? Do you have a sexy enough career? Do you have this kind of status one way or another? Do you have something that financially makes you not just stable, but stable with a plan, stable with an upward mobility? And if you don't, then all of a sudden the questions are like, what's wrong with you? Do you need to go find yourself? Do you need to go do this? Do you need to go do that? Like this idea that it is not. So there's this churning that happens during that if somebody has decided, okay, these are the values I have, these are the things that matter, this is the way I want to live a human life, and that still doesn't yield any yourself at all decently, and it's not going to give you any status. You're not getting married and having kids and there's like following along a particular trajectory, or you're not, all of these things. That's what's happening to these characters. And yet I think it's this moment where I know as an artist that, I used to track the drop-off points. Like, how many people quit music at 25? How many people quit music at 30? How many people quit music at 35? When you're 40, you're a lifer. If you're an artist and you're 40 years old, you have tried to quit. You've probably tried to quit and find other things. And you can't, and you're a lifer. But when you're each one of these places, they're saying, well, what will I trade for this? What will I trade for that? How much do I want to go to Thanksgiving or to be out with my friends and feel like I can say something that's on par with the status they're bringing to it? Like, there's all this anxiety of status that comes out of it. Marketability and sexuality with women in terms of how it is portrayed in marriage or in power, social, economic power in another way. The way that it comes up in the novel, in the sense of the way that Cheyenne is frustrated with how people have to be reduced to a small story to say they were this, which was cute, and now they did this one magic trick, and now they're this, and I can describe them at every stage of that. Like it was a story of becoming, and now they're there. And so what do you do if all the things you care about and all the people and none of it fits into that? Well, do you settle? Do you adapt? Do you admit that this wasn't for you in the beginning? Like there's all these. So I feel like in the 30s, sort of 33 to 37, I'm being arbitrary, but like, kind of in that range, is this shuffling again of who sort of like lowers the stakes, makes the compromises. And I don't mean that in the sense of anybody who sells out. I don't mean it in such stupid terms, but like decides I'd rather have this than that. And then maybe they give away parts of themselves. I mean, I know, you know, anybody who's been around people who talk about things directly knows that how many conversations do you have with people in a certain age, in a certain set, who are like, yeah, you know, I feel like I'm not really living my life. Like I'm not really living, you know what I mean? Like there's this great disconnect of what was traded off or not. So those choices are real and they're there and they're not petty. And we've treated those choices like they only belong to the wealthy, who are given permanent reinvention, and an entire economic culture around reinvention. But I guess that second coming of age is true, I think, for most people, unless you're just, I mean, for most people, there is that second coming of age. And the characters that I love so much and have such a soft spot for, are the grifters, are the people of bad decisions from the outside, and sometimes truly, but the people who are the lifers, the people for whom, they can't be less authentic. Yeah, they can't quite, they can work, they can show up, they can do their job, but they can't sell themselves. And they can't, like they just can't do the performance of it, and that's the, I love those kind of characters. So, on the one hand, I hear that the characters in, sometimes in my novel or novels about this feel very young. I would push back on that and say that's in a lot of ways because we're talking economics. And there is this sort of great push to, well, what do you do if the way that you're supposed to get by is, yeah, can Livy and Cheyenne get out of the poverty? And sure, if they want to work 2 to 3 jobs into their 40s and save everything and amass some level of capital. Who wants to work 2 to 3 jobs and perform it? For whom are we performing? And so there are different values in life than just that. And so I don't see that as an aspect of child, although they are childish in certain ways, but like, yeah.
But I think that's the interesting thing about your characters in your novel, and what makes your novel so special to me, and probably also to Paula. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for talking to us that early in the morning in Portland.
Cut it in half, like take one question. Like, I'm so sorry that I...
All the success for you, and have a great that it goes on like this for you. I hope that you have the opportunity to meet people very soon, of course, but probably won't be before Easter next year. But anyway, you have given us a very beautiful novel.
Yes.
Yeah, it comes out in January in England, and then it comes out at some point in 2021 on Einaudi and translation, and I know the other translation rights, I don't have a timeline on it, so maybe I'll have a reason to go to Europe at some point.
You're welcome.
Oh, great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Bye-bye.
So generous.
Have a
You're
good
so
day.
sweet. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.